Leading up to the July crisis that started up the First World War, Germany was in a bit of a geopolitical pickle. Germany was a rising industrial and military power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it was geographically and politically encircled by essentially political adversaries: France to the west, Russia to the east, and Britain, with its naval dominance, looming across the North Sea. This encirclement, compounded by the entangling alliances that created the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, drove Germany's leadership, particularly Field Admiral Graf Alfred von Schlieffen, to develop the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy that was seemingly Germany's only hope at avoiding or winning a two-front war with France and Russia. Of course, Russia and France had the Franco-Russian Entente in 1894, after France's loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, which sparked a huge institutionalized societal movement of French revanchism, basically ensuring that there would be a war between Germany and France whenever the opportunity presented itself. Russia, though less industrialized than Germany, possessed an absolutely massive manpower pool and was undergoing military reforms, primarily after its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which embarrassed the Russian Empire and temporarily weakened it, but at the same time also spurred efforts to modernize the country very quickly to keep up with the rest of the world. Britain was not formally allied with France and Russia until the Triple Entente solidified in 1907, but it was still, before that, very antagonistic toward Germany, thanks primarily to their economic competition, but also due to a naval arms race and the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911. Even though Germany offered to help Britain during the Boer War and tried to maintain fair relations with the British, personal animosity among the monarchs and the simple realities of pre-war European geopolitics pit these rising industrial empires against one another. It was the animosity with Britain that heightened Germany's sense of encirclement, a fear that was held even more deeply by the German General Staff, who believed that valuable time was slipping away as Russia's military strength grew, and that soon Germany would be militarily unable to counter the Triple Entente. By 1914, Germany's leadership even believed that a preventative war might be necessary to break this encirclement before Russia's industrialization and railway improvements, partly funded by French loans, made it an overwhelming Eastern threat. Of course, the July crisis of 1914 provided this outlet, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Germany had been allied with Austria-Hungary since 1879, which was both a strategic asset and a liability. Austria-Hungary was itself a multi-ethnic empire, plagued by internal divisions, and it essentially came to rely on German support to counter Russian influence in the Balkans, where Pan-Slavism and Serbian nationalism crippled Austria's control over Bosnia and other South Slavic regions of the empire. Germany issued a blank check to Austria-Hungary on July 5, 1914, after the assassination of Ferdinand, offering unconditional support to the Austrians for whatever their response would be to Serbia. Kaiser Wilhelm II actually believed that this reassurance and a swift Austrian action would deter other powers from involving themselves, localizing the conflict to just the Balkans. Unfortunately, however, this view overestimated how much Austria-Hungary wanted peace, and also their ability to act decisively. Of course, once Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia rapidly mobilized, and France, despite the Franco-Russian alliance being a defensive pact and technically not obligating the French to enter, joined the war anyway and pulled Germany into a two-front war, precisely the scenario its military planners wanted to avoid. But just because they wanted to avoid it didn't mean they weren't ready for it. We mentioned von Schlieffen's plan, which was actually devised all the way back around 1897. Schlieffen, who was the chief of the German General Staff from 1891 to 1906, drew inspiration from the Prussian victory in the Franco-Prussian War, which used rapid mobilization and select very key and very decisive battles to achieve a victory over Napoleon III. He also drew some inspiration from Hannibal's double envelopment at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, which he saw as a model for annihilating a larger enemy force, albeit a quite ancient one. Now, von Schlieffen's plan was formalized in a 1905 memorandum, and its primary goal was to deliver a knockout blow to France before Russia could fully mobilize, allowing Germany to then shift their forces to the east to hold off the Russians. Schlieffen assumed that Russia's mobilization would take at least 6 weeks, due to its underdeveloped infrastructure, which would provide a window for Germany to defeat France decisively. The plan thus called for a massive offensive through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg, bypassing France's fortified eastern border along Alsace-Lorraine. Approximately 90% of Germany's western forces would form a strong right hook to sweep through Belgium, encircle Paris, and crush French armies against a smaller German force in the south, achieving a Vernichtungsschlacht, or Battle of Annihilation, within 6 weeks. This was a direct manifestation of the Prussian military doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, a war of movement, a method of battle based on speed and decisive action to compensate for Germany's limited natural resources compared to the Entente powers, who commanded huge colonial empires. Schlieffen's plan was ambitious, but it was a bit too ambitious, and it rested on several critical assumptions. It required a precise execution, relying on railway networks being exactly on time in order to move troops rapidly. It also relied on the ability to seize and repair Belgian railways for supply lines. It assumed minimal resistance from Belgium, a neutral country, and, most egregiously, that Britain would not intervene to uphold the 1839 Treaty of London, guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. Schlieffen also anticipated that France would adopt a defensive posture, allowing Germany to envelop its armies. These assumptions came from Schlieffen's more academic approach. He was informed by war games and theoretical models rather than actual battlefield experience, and by the Prussian military's obsession with rapid victory. Now, Schlieffen's plan didn't actually make it to the front lines, but a modified iteration of it did, implemented under Helmut von Moltke the Younger in 1914, which also failed to achieve its objectives. We'll still be calling this modified plan the Schlieffen Plan for simplicity, but it was technically a different war plan. Now, when Helmut von Moltke the Younger succeeded Schlieffen in 1906, the plan was already controversial within the German military. Moltke was even less confident in Schlieffen's vision, so he made significant modifications that actually changed the intent altogether. He reduced the strength of the right hook, allocating more troops to defend Alsace-Lorraine against a French offensive, which was a smart move considering France's Plan 17 for war with Germany. And he also allocated more troops to the Eastern Front to counter Russia. Moltke also excluded the Netherlands from the invasion to avoid antagonizing another neutral power, one that was already tacitly sympathetic to them, narrowing the invasion corridor through Belgium. These changes, despite Moltke's better understanding of the situation on the ground in the German military, actually counterintuitively weakened the plan and the offensive's momentum. Critics, including historian Gerhard Bernhard Ritter of the University of Freiburg, argued that Moltke's alterations actually undermined the plan's core principle of overwhelming force. Regardless of the alterations, either iteration of the plan was likely doomed to fail, and we saw firsthand how miserably Germany's operations on the Western Front were delayed. The invasion of Belgium on August 4th triggered Britain's entry into the war, as the British Expeditionary Force deployed faster than expected to support Belgium and France. Belgian resistance was way greater than expected, like at Liège, which further delayed the German advance that was already behind schedule due to train delays. The Belgians in their country destroyed railways and bridges, which hurt Germany's logistics even more. Beyond that, each German corps, which was composed of 44,000 men and about 12,000 horses, required a ton of supplies to sustain themselves, and the plan expected these corps to march 25 to 32 kilometers daily, which was already unrealistic during training, let alone under combat conditions. Combine that with poor roads, enemy resistance, and bottlenecks in their supply lines, and the whole situation left German troops exhausted and undersupplied by the time they reached northern France. The French, under General Joseph Joffre, mobilized more quickly than anticipated, using their rail network and even Parisian taxis to rush reinforcements to the First Battle of the Marne. At the same time, Russia's offensive into East Prussia by mid-August forced Germany to divert 2 corps from the Western Front, which only weakened the right hook even more. Moltke himself had some untimely hesitation, and beyond this, there was already poor communication with the field commanders, all leading to a German retreat after the Marne, ending any hopes of a quick victory and ushering in the long trench war that, along with Britain's naval blockade, would slowly bleed Germany dry. But in reality, there was actually no other real plan Germany could stick to. We have to remember that the Germans didn't have the over a century of hindsight that we have. There were no alternate plans, and the German general staff were kind of backed into a corner, encircled by hostile powers and reliant on a weak and fragile ally. The plan's collapse at the Marne in September 1914, only a few months after the war had broken out, was devastating, as Moltke reportedly told Kaiser Wilhelm II, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Schlieffen plan, or at least its iteration, actually worked? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our current channel members: Eaglefall, Derek Arno Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Roanoke, Star Galaxy, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, Alphonse Maurice, PJ the Homeless Mage, Chance Bowman, Justin Ambrew, Dark X, Scott Williams, Kennedy the V, Rex Ferris, History with Troy, C. Zachary Myers, Grim Reaper KL, and Matthew Jelly. Thank you, and enjoy the video. So a successful Schlieffen plan means the capture of Paris and total French capitulation. If we presume that somehow the Schlieffen plan succeeded, even in spite of everything going against it, the Great War would probably actually not unfold as a sort of protracted and grinding conflict like the one we know from our history, but more so a rapid, decisive campaign that would probably only last a few months. The massive, wing-shaped sweep through Belgium and northern France, assuming it works, would crush the French, Belgian, and perhaps British forces in a lightning-quick offensive. It is worth it to consider keeping Britain neutral for the sake of this scenario, as it would fulfill one of the original assumptions of von Schlieffen, which turned out to be false. Regardless, whichever way the British fall, by early October 1914, Paris would have fallen, and France would probably sue for peace. The Great War, as history would remember it, would become the Lightning War. The Blitzkrieg, if you will. Germany, Austria, Belgium, France, and perhaps the British too, would draw up a treaty dictating the outcome of the war in the West. In our own history, France imposed arguably harsh and humiliating terms of peace against Germany after the First World War, and it's not hard to understand why the French took this more punitive approach. France had felt the brunt of the war in the West, with the majority of the fighting occurring in and devastating French territory. French revanchists also felt that it was an opportunity to get back at Germany for the Franco-Prussian War, and that imposing the harshest possible terms on Germany were simply a matter of French survival. France forced Germany to accept blame for the war. Mind you, a war which started over the assassination of an Austrian archduke by a Bosnian Serb, which pulled in the Russian Empire, which then caused Germany to join to defend Austria. Furthermore, France imposed debatably harsh economic penalties on Germany, and forced them to nearly completely demilitarize. Again, these terms were motivated by the devastation the war caused to France's economy, requiring a supplemental source of income to even keep the victors' economies afloat, so it's not as if France was just a mad, belligerent actor at the Versailles Congress or something. It was acting under the pretext of a means to prevent a repeat scenario and secure lasting peace for Europe. Of course, needless to say, that lasting peace didn't last much at all, and the harsh terms imposed on Germany contributed to, did not cause, but certainly fueled the rise of National Socialism, the degree to which we can certainly debate some other time, but as a result of that we got a little thing called the Second World War. The thing is, however, in this alternate timeline, Germany would have suffered a mere fraction of the casualties compared to the French in our own history. They also would not feel the same sense of humiliation, nor would they see a need to remedy or prevent any sort of widespread wartime devastation, which they would never really have bore witness to. This lightning war wouldn't have destroyed German territory and farmland in the same way the Great War of our own history did to France. Now, Germany still probably would have imposed a harsh peace relative to the impact of the war in this timeline. In the Franco-Prussian War, Germany imposed pretty harsh indemnities on the French relative to the scale of the war, and after this lightning war, France would still be their primary continental rival and would have demonstrated belligerence against them in calling upon the Franco-Russian Treaty. However, it's likely that these peace terms wouldn't necessarily be as impactful to the French as the Peace of Versailles had been to Germany, at least in the economic sense. Instead, the armistice signed between Germany and the defeated Western powers would focus primarily on just dismantling French power. The treaty would probably enforce a significant reduction of the French peacetime army, the demolition of the formidable border fortifications along the Franco-German boundary, and the establishment of a demilitarized buffer zone, all designed to keep France just weak enough to not threaten Germany for the foreseeable future. We probably wouldn't see the creation of a Belgian duchy, as the September program had informally suggested in our own history, and instead the Low Countries would be politically and economically tied to Germany through other means. Germany had no aims on French colonies, as it didn't have the merchant navy to make them profitable, nor did it really want territory from France, though it would probably try to exert economic influence over the Brie-Longwy iron mines in northern France, and I apologize for the pronunciation. These mines produced invaluable resources for the French steel industry that Germany wanted for themselves. The British public would probably find the war a disappointment, but being spared any incredible devastation, the British Empire would probably simply find it reasonable to retreat to its role as the world's leading naval power and focus its attention on its vast colonial holdings in Africa, India, and elsewhere, which would of course remain intact. Now, with France incapacitated in the east, Russia and Serbia would have quickly found themselves isolated, and in Russia's case, greatly overextended. The psychological blow of France's collapse and the swift, successful blitz of German forces in the west would probably compel Russia to sue for peace. This would leave Serbia completely helpless, as the Austrians, but particularly the Germans now, would move in and end the conflict by December, though not without likely heavy Austrian losses. In the ensuing treaties, Serbia would be demilitarized and forced to pay significant war reparations to Austria. Austria did not explicitly want to annex Serbia at the beginning of the war, and especially since the war has ended too early for Bulgaria to join, which historically happened in October of 1915, there is no need to divide Serbia after the war. However, this very weak Serbia will probably come under Bulgaria's crosshairs in a Third Balkan War of sorts eventually. In the east, Poland would probably come under German oversight. Control might be a stretch, but oversight I can see happening. But what's interesting is there would be no grand annexations, no incredible, extraordinary redrawing of the map of Europe. Instead, Germany's vision would be to stabilize Europe under her economic and military influence, creating a new status quo rather than redrawing the map entirely, a status quo built not around Paris, but Berlin. Given the relatively quick end to the war, Austria-Hungary, having subdued Serbia and solidifying its variable hegemony over the Balkans, now faces less of an existential threat. They would have to focus on rooting out extremist groups in the Balkans wherever possible. However, while it is true that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would still have to deal with internal ethnic divisions and political turmoil, I think that without the strain of a long, drawn-out war, Austria-Hungary actually might have time to grapple with the issues facing it. Funnily enough, this might just be one of the first World War I videos I've made where Austria-Hungary doesn't just implode. But don't get your hopes up yet, as the Habsburg Empire would lumber on, but would probably require a strong, stabilizing force in order to prevent its collapse. The United States, too, which would of course be untouched by the conflict, would bask in the same pre-war isolationism that enveloped its politics. Without the economic boom provided by war contracts and that post-war reconstruction, the United States isn't immediately the same global financial powerhouse, but that does not mean that the US isn't an important global power. The United States would serve as a market and a supplier for Europe, which would inevitably serve to further enrich the British, who already had an internal market in the form of India, but required stable external markets like America and Germany to uphold their superpower status. That being said, the United States still looks a bit different in this timeline. The Roaring Twenties, if they occur at all, do not reach the heights of exuberance seen in our history. But furthermore, the lack of excruciating war debts on major world powers means we don't see a Great Depression either, which makes the rise of extremist groups in Europe and abroad a bit less likely. And it also means that the USA continues to grow economically without a boom and bust cycle. America will still eventually have to deal with the Dust Bowl, but we're probably not going to see a stock market crash or bank runs. The 1916 election, which would occur in a nation that has largely sidestepped any global turmoil, would end up being a pretty close contest between Woodrow Wilson running for re-election against Republican Charles Evans Hughes, who had been a critic of Wilson's cautious foreign policy and was an advocate for a far more assertive American stance, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Wilson wouldn't have the strong campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," but he also might actually command some broad support among German Americans, thanks to American neutrality, which would be perceived as contributing to the German victory. German Americans already supported neutrality in our own history, and now it would have paid off for the more nationalistic subset of this population. I do think that this election would be particularly close, but it's more probable that with the economic stability of this world, Wilson would probably just win re-election in 1916. Now, without the impetus to assume a leading global role, the United States would remain focused on the Monroe Doctrine, the Western Hemisphere, consolidating its influence over Central and South American nations and probably shaping them into political and economic dependencies. People often forget that prior to the Great War in our own history, the United States was focused on intervention in the Americas, and furthermore was still in a significant economic incline in late 1800s, having witnessed higher production outputs and higher per capita income than its European counterparts, even the British Empire. Given a relatively secure and stable America, this trend is actually likely to continue, and this opens the door for the United States to focus more on expanding its influence in East Asia as well, perhaps developing the Philippines more or intervening in China. Additionally, in this timeline, the Ottoman Empire has remained neutral, as the war's brevity would have probably prevented the escalation that prompted its entry in our timeline on October 29, 1914. Avoiding war means Ottoman resources aren't wasted, and it allows the Turkish government to continue industrialization. It also means that the ethnic cleansing and bloodbaths of World War I in Anatolia and the Middle East in our history do not occur, which alters the demographics of this alternate Ottoman Empire. But the Ottomans are still weak, even if they face less immediate pressure from the European powers. Britain would actually have little incentive to challenge Ottoman control over the Middle East, especially without the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a product of the prolonged nature of wartime negotiations in our timeline. The discovery of oil in Ottoman Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, around 1905, however, might change this, though it might also just be able to reverse the Ottoman sickness of sorts. Assuming the Young Turks are able to maintain state control of these oil reserves through the Turkish Petrol Company and don't sell them off to the British, Iraqi oil would spur on steady economic growth, with these oil companies extracting the resources and generating decent revenue, which would strengthen the Ottoman state, probably allowing the Sultan and the Young Turks to pursue modernization without fear of crippling the government financially and facing debt crises that plagued the empire historically. There are two big buts to this, however. First, the Turks didn't necessarily have total control over Ottoman oil resources. Prior to the Young Turk Revolution, Sultan Abdul-Mahid II was already aware of Mesopotamia's oil potential, and he tried to balance the interests of Britain and Germany rather than granting exclusive control to any one entity. Now, this isn't the end of the world, but it does mean that the Ottomans will perhaps have to contend with British influence, or at least interest in their economy and government. The other but is that nationalist movements are still likely to rise. We probably wouldn't see foreign-backed revolts like the Arab Revolt precipitated by British support, so there won't be any significant uprisings against the Young Turks, but the Ottomans would have to constantly focus on countering these nationalist movements, and particularly in Arabia, countering Saudi tribal unification efforts. An oil-rich and relatively stable Ottoman Empire will probably also now formalize agreements with the Germans, Europe's sort of uncontested hegemon for the time being, regarding the Berlin-Baghdad railway project, which was a concept dating back to the late 1880s, but would now be financially viable, especially with the discovery of oil in the Ottoman Empire. And this would fall right in line with Germany's ambitions for a Mitteleuropa project, a framework to solidify their economic control over the continent. This railway project, I imagine, would quickly become the cornerstone of Ottoman-German cooperation. Britain probably wouldn't even impede this ambition, as they would want to maintain trade access through the Ottoman-controlled Bosphorus, avoiding direct confrontation with the Ottomans, which would cut off said access. Now, this railway would stretch from the northwestern coasts of Germany through Berlin, down through Austria-Hungary, and into Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, stretching as far as the Persian Gulf and Ottoman territory. The only gap in this connection would be between Hungary and Bulgaria, leaving the Germans and the Ottomans with two options: to build through Serbia, through the city of Niš, which was the original plan in our own history, or through Romania, which historically sided with the Entente. But in this history, with the Great War over before Romania could have even joined, Romania probably actually would have become the better choice, ruled by the pro-German Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen dynasty under King Carol I, who would have passed in 1914, succeeded by Ferdinand I. Ferdinand already would lean toward Germany, especially after this timeline's defeat of Russia, which would have stripped the Russians of their regional influence. Romanian politicians were historically divided between pro-German and pro-Entente factions, but with a decisive German victory in this lightning war, they would now undoubtedly tilt toward Germany, especially with the economic incentives of access to German markets, and investment in Romanian infrastructure that would come with integration into Germany's sphere of influence. Thus, the railway's route would proceed through Romania, connecting Budapest to Sofia, with German engineers overseeing construction and Romanian elites benefiting from the trade. The only pretty big elephant in the room would be Romanian aims in Transylvania, and whether or not these aims would become vigorous enough to cause cracks in the coalition of congruent countries is up for debate. In my opinion, the economic incentives would probably outweigh the nationalist ambitions of those Romanian politicians, many of whom we might assume to have been pro-Entente, explicitly for war gains in a war that would not have escalated like it had in our own history. Anyway, we also mentioned the potential for a Third Balkan War. Serbia, which is now demilitarized and financially burdened by reparations to Austria-Hungary, would be ripe for the picking, as the Bulgarians had thought was the case in the Second Balkan War. Bulgaria would want Macedonia, which it lost to Serbia and Greece in 1913, and I'd hedge a bet that a war over Macedonia is almost guaranteed in this alternate timeline, though the pretext would be a bit dubious. Bulgaria could easily defeat this demilitarized Serbia in such a war, though it is also a matter of consideration whether or not this conflict would involve Greece, who were decently powerful enough, though we're dealing with internal political divisions in the form of the national schism. Actually, this conflict might be a perfect setup for Bulgaria, a distracted Greece and a crippled Serbia, allowing it to force an annexation of Macedonia. The biggest question is whether or not other powers would intervene. Austria preferred stability in the Balkans, and probably would fear South Slavic uprisings springing out of this conflict, and Germany would also prefer stability, though they would harbor less explicit opposition to Bulgarian ambitions. Both powers would thus probably discourage Bulgarian aggression, but support it diplomatically, provided it doesn't escalate into a broader conflict. Now, unfortunately for the Russians, they are also unlikely to intervene directly. This would effectively shut the door to Russian influence in the Balkans, destroying Russia's once near hegemonic control over the peninsula following the First Balkan War. Now, we additionally briefly mentioned a very interesting plan of Germany's called Mitteleuropa, articulated in our timeline through the aforementioned September Program of 1914. The Mitteleuropa project was a plan to create a Central European economic and political bloc under German leadership, including Germany, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, and the territories they planned to annex or exert influence over, like Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and the other Benelux nations. Now, as we mentioned before, the September program was informal. It wasn't the actual pragmatic plan the Germans wanted to implement, and was more just high-level discussions in the German military and German political scene. However, the concept was still integral to their and the Austrians' post-war vision. In this timeline, you'll notice that many of those territories are still under Russian control, and this complicates Germany's ambition. But it might actually be better for them in the short term, as the Germans would be forced to pursue this vision of Mitteleuropa not through territorial annexation, but through economic dominance and infrastructure projects in other countries, with the flagship of this being the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. With this pivot in vision toward the south instead of the east, Germany actually doesn't overextend itself, and makes itself literally invaluable to the global economy, as much of Europe is still industrializing, and thus Germany would probably actually gain more with less effort than if it were directly trying to control a continent-spanning imperial domain. This would be, of course, bolstered by Ottoman oil, as well as the rail connection which would enhance coordination between these states, and also American trade, with Germany and its Mitteleuropa project now probably competing fiercely with the British in American markets. One interesting thing to consider is that Germany would probably opt to integrate France into this Mitteleuropa in order to pacify it and create French reliance on the German economy to prevent another war. This would precipitate the creation of a more pragmatic pro-cooperation bloc in French politics that would come to oppose the likely now very powerful revanchists and nationalists. Germany would encourage French participation in a Central European trade bloc, offering tariff reductions and joint industrial projects that would also integrate the Benelux nations, which would also provide the Germans a means to conduct a strict oversight of France's disarmament. Assuming France's inclusion works, which is again a slight stretch, Mitteleuropa's economic base would be incredibly strong, and would also discourage an exceptionally radical form of French revanchism by tying its economic future to Germany and by positioning France as a sort of junior partner in this project. Now, Germany's approach to Russia, on the other hand, would likely be a bit more complex, given Russia's size, its resource potential, and their rivalry. Excluding Russia from Mitteleuropa would risk alienating a recovering power that could eventually challenge German hegemony, especially in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. However, integrating Russia fully is problematic due to Russian politicians' pan-Slavic tendencies and ambitions, which would completely clash with Austria-Hungary's interests, not to mention the existing fear of Russian industrialization. I think the Germans would attempt to pursue economic engagement, albeit very limited, at least to repair ties with Tsar Nicholas II while keeping Russia at an arm's length. This policy probably won't work out too well beyond the exchange of grain, especially as Russia starts to cough and creak, taking on the role from the Ottomans of Europe's sick man. Russia's rapid sequence of defeats in the Russo-Japanese War, the Second Balkan War, this Lightning War, and now the Third Balkan War, would absolutely neuter the Tsar's legitimacy. The Duma held pro-Serbian and pan-Slavic ambitions and would already be up in arms over the defeat, not to mention the lack of Russian support for Serbia in this Third Balkan War. But if Nicholas dissolved the Duma, unrest would break out. On the other hand, however, the longer he let the Duma's frustrations fester, the closer he would get to this unrest anyway. Nicholas, tragically, already would lack the strong temperament to deal with such an empire as early 20th century Russia was, and even without the economic devastation of a prolonged Great War, the psychological and political toll of these defeats would probably destroy his rule. A revolution is likely, though its scale and nature would be very different from our timeline's Bolshevik revolution. This revolution would be smaller, more localized, and less ideologically radical without the sheer devastation and loss of life of the Great War. Instead, it likely would be fully set off by some sort of economic stagnation, food shortages, or perhaps nationalist sentiments in the Baltic regions emboldened by Germany's oversight in Poland. Crucially, unlike in our timeline, where Germany facilitated and funded Lenin's return in 1917 to destabilize Russia, Lenin would be stuck in exile in Switzerland. So, in this alternate revolution, the main players would be the moderate socialists, or the Mensheviks, going up against liberal reformers in the Duma, like the Cadets, and nationalist groups, with the military playing a pivotal role in either suppressing or joining the unrest. This revolution would likely manifest itself as a series of uprisings rather than a sort of full-scale civil war, all centered in urban areas and the border regions. I imagine Tsar Nicholas may abdicate in favor of a constitutional monarchy, perhaps actually under his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, with the Germans intervening diplomatically, probably in support of the Cadets or a military-led government under someone like Brusilov, to prevent radical socialist takeover. German troops in Poland would help to deter nationalist uprisings from escalating, and I do actually imagine the crisis would be able to resolve itself by the mid-1920s, with a reformed Tsar state now even more dependent on the military's loyalty to the Tsar. This constitutional monarchy would have a more organized parliamentary body, which could probably go about enacting land reforms and whatnot, but would probably begin to lose control over its Central Asian and Far Eastern territories. Now, as the years unfold, and Germany continues to consolidate its economic hold over Europe, France, though still economically tied to Germany and somewhat reliant on its markets, would still undoubtedly be just boiling with this sort of festering anger and discontent. Hardcore anti-German figures like Charles de Gaulle and now the older André Maginot, symbols of a resurgent French nationalism, would begin to politically represent a national desire to reclaim France's lost honor and independence. In the streets of Paris, the rhetoric of revanchism will return, perhaps in a similar fashion to that seen in Italy during the interwar period in our own history. Certain factions of this resurgent revanchist nationalist faction would even call for a new revolution to rid the nation of what would be perceived as a German economic imperialism. These anti-German factions would be a mix of conservatives, Republicans, and radicals. However, the threat of another war with Germany, which it could be imagined would end in a swift blitz of France not unlike the previous one, will probably prevent these factions from outright revolt. That said, without the catastrophic upheavals of the drawn-out Great War, radical ideologies like fascism and National Socialism and vanguardism will probably fail to gain the same foothold outside of this revanchist France and perhaps Serbia and Russia as well, but it's difficult to say how great of an opportunity they would even have to carve their names into the history books as they had in Italy or Spain early on. Instead, now, the kind of brewing conflict in Europe would be less ideological and more economic, seeing a new kind of rivalry take shape and pit Germany's sort of pseudo-continental system against Britain's imperial network with the undertone of this French movement for economic independence. Throughout this time, we might assume that the German and British systems, while fundamentally different, will have become simultaneously competitive and interdependent, in much the same way that the US and China are in our own day and age. With Germany's industrial might and Britain's access to global resources, they would have formed a sort of mutually beneficial, albeit inevitably quite tense, relationship, with trade still flowing between the two spheres, fueling economic growth on both sides, but still with this underlying deep-seated competition for dominance, both powers engaging in a constant tug-of-war to gain the upper hand. Clearly, the powers that be are beginning to curve themselves toward a collision course, as is the case throughout history. France's discontent will at some point reach a boiling point. Across the world, a secondary conflict would be on the horizon. The growing power of Japan increasingly puts it at odds with the United States. The Russians will find themselves cut off from the rest of Europe. The British in a fierce economic rivalry with Germany, and the French on the verge of total chaos. But that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm. And subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.